Hey there, horror fans. Welcome back to Real Talk Horror Edition, the podcast where I dig into those dark corners of cinema, peel back the flesh, and see what's festering underneath. I'm your host, Josh, and today I'm not just digging deep, I'm hitting rewind hard. I want to crack open one of the most notorious, blood soaked, tabloid hyped eras in history of horror. Today's topic are the UK's video nasties. Even if you've only heard the term in passing, it probably set off a little spark in your horror-loving heart. Video Nasties. It sounds like a punk band that opened for the Misfits back in '82 or a Lost Trauma label imprint. And honestly, it kind of feels like both. Just hearing the phrase conjures up images of dusty VHS tapes on a high shelf behind the counter, red warning stickers slapped over lurid cover art, and grainy bootlegs passed between sweaty palms at horror conventions. These were the movies that your mom warned you about, the ones local politicians wanted burned in the streets, the ones that supposedly turned kids into psychos, or at the very least, weirdos like us. But what were the video nasties really? Why did they freak out an entire nation? And who decided which films were nasty enough to make the cut or get the axe? Well, grab a blank VHS, slide it into the tape deck, and make sure to hit that tracking button because we are rewinding all the way back to the mid 70s to find out. So let me set the scene. Picture it Britain, the mid 70s. Punk is in full swing. Margaret Thatcher has just come into power, and working class families are starting to get their hands on a shiny, miraculous new device, the VCR. Now, if you weren't around back then, or you were but your memory's a little fuzzy from the late night horror marathons, here's why this moment. Before the rise of home video, watching movies was a communal act. You either caught them in the theater or waited for the heavily edited TV broadcast. But with the arrival of VHS and Betamax, because it had its moment, you could now bring movies home. You could rent them, collect them, and most importantly, watch them whenever the hell you wanted, over and over. This created a gold rush for independent film distributors. Suddenly, mom and pop video companies popped up left and right, licensing films that mainstream studios would never touch. And these weren't just any films. We're talking low budget horror, European exploitation, cannibal flicks, sexual abuse revenge sagas, satanic panic fodder, giallo bloodbaths, and all the glorious, gory, go-for-broke cinema that lived outside the bounds of quote-unquote good taste. And here's the kicker. The UK had laws in place for theatrical releases. Thanks to the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, they could censor films, ban them, or demand cuts before anything ever hit a theater screen. But on home video, that was still this wild, lawless frontier. There were no ratings for VHS, no oversight, no guidelines. So what happened? Well, initially, horror fans rejoiced. The BBFC, the censors, the uptight suits, they had no jurisdiction over your living room. So if you wanted to watch a film where a zombie wrestled the shark, thank you, zombie, or where someone's eyeball gets gouged out in a loving close-up, the Beyond, or where the entire plot revolves around cannibal tribes eating tourists, think Cannibal Ferox, well, you could do that at home, in your pajamas, with pizza and your unsuspecting grandmother in the next room. But not everyone saw this as a win for the artistic freedom and genre innovation. Enter the moral panic. Around 1982-1983, conservative MPs, church leaders, parent groups, and, let's be real, the most shrill of UK tabloids like the Daily Mail started waging war. They blamed violent horror tapes for everything from juvenile delinquency to the breakdown of society. One article infamously claimed that kids were sitting around after school watching videos where people are hacked to pieces, raped, and eaten alive, like it was a Wednesday ritual between cartoons and homework. And of course, they found their scapegoat in horror. The term video nasties was coined during this time. fueled by headlines like "Ban this evil video" or "How horror is infecting our youth." If you've ever seen old newspaper clippings or grainy news footage from the era, it's this surreal mix of sensationalism and straight up fear mongering. Tapes were shown out of context. Politicians would hold press conferences waving blood covered VHS sleeves. Horror fans were painted as perverts, degenerates, or future serial killers. And, like all good witch hunts, there had to be a list. In 1983, the Director of Public Prosecutions, the DPP, compiled what became known as the Video Nasties list. This was essentially a hit list of movies that were being prosecuted or could be prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. That's right, these movies weren't just being banned. People could be arrested for selling or renting them. Some shop owners were even jailed. There were 72 titles on the original list. I'll put a link to those titles in the show notes. Some were pulled for graphic violence, others for sexual content, some for a mix of both, and a few, honestly, just for having sleazy cover art. The criteria? Well, it was wildly inconsistent. One distributor was reportedly told the film was too violent, even though the actual movie was missing key scenes entirely due to poor tape quality. The censors were flying blind, and the results were absurd. Here are a few titles that earned a spot on that unholy roster. The Evil Dead, Sam Raimi's scrappy supernatural classic, was too nasty for shelves. The Driller Killer, Abel Ferrara's gritty urban slasher, was treated like a snuff film. I Spit on Your Grave, a sexual assault revenge film that sparked massive debate and remains controversial. Cannibal Holocaust, possibly the most infamous of the bunch, was banned almost everywhere. Zombie, Zombie 2, Zombie Flesh Eaters, Lucio Fulci's squishy, maggot-filled zombie epic. SS Experiment Camp, Nazi exploitation trash that gave the censors an aneurysm. Tenebrae, Dario Argento's razor-sharp giallo, stylish and savage. Don't Go in the Woods, which was low-budget nonsense, but apparently dangerous nonsense. And Last House on the Left, crude, raw, and ahead of its time, but also deeply unsettling. Some of these films were eventually dropped from the list. Others remained banned for years. A few were prosecuted in court, while others were quietly buried, lost in VHS limbo. But there's a twist. All this panic, it backfired. Because as many horror fans know, forbidden fruit tastes sweeter. Once a film got labeled a video nasty, it became a badge of honor. Collectors wanted them. Fans traded tapes like contraband. Whole fanzines were built around tracking down and reviewing the nastiest of the nasties. It was horror's punk rock moment, a rebellion against moral policing, a middle finger to censorship. And the films themselves? Well, some were just gore for gore's sake, sure, but others were genuinely innovative, stylish, and influential. The panic finally culminated in 1984 with the passage of the Video Recordings Act, which made it a legal requirement for all VHS releases in the UK to be classified by the BBFC. In other words, the Wild West of home video was over. From that point forward, if your film didn't get approved, it didn't get sold. But the legacy of the Video Nasties, it didn't end there. They left scars and they left stories. For horror lovers, they became part of the mythos. These weren't just movies. They were statements. And watching one was an act of rebellion. Owning one meant that you were in the know. And now, decades later, many of these once banned films have been restored, re-released, and reassessed, not as corrupting filth, but as a part of horror history. So let's talk about the list that lit the fuse. So in 1983, the UK government, specifically the Director of Public Prosecutions, or DPP, decided to play horror hall monitor. They compiled a list of 72 films that were either actively being prosecuted or that were considered likely to be prosecuted under the UK's Obscene Publications Act. This infamous compilation is what became known as the Video Nasty List, and once it hit the press, it might as well have been bound in human flesh and inked in blood, because the panic it unleashed was downright apocalyptic. Now here's the wild thing. This list, it wasn't a who's who of universally condemned filth. It wasn't carefully curated with some objective standard of what was genuinely dangerous or even harmful. It was just an unholy mismatch of gory, grindhouse, and grimy, or just plain misunderstood films. And some of the films were nasty, no question. I Spit on Your Grave is a prime example. But others, well, they were just weird or provocative. Maybe they were just foreign or independent. Or perhaps they were just not playing by the rules that those British moral watchdogs set up. We talked about a handful of those movies in the previous segment there, but that's just a small taste. While some of the 72 were technically horror films, others were softcore sleaze, revenge fantasies, and some were just bizarre European imports that didn't really fit into the neat little boxes. So, what made these films so dangerous, or at least so threatening to proper British society that they had to be eradicated? Well, I think that's where this really gets juicy. So, to understand the Video Nasties panic, you've got to look at the cultural soup of early 80s Britain. The country was under Margaret Thatcher's conservative rule. Unemployment was rising, and the media landscape was shifting fast. Suddenly, thanks to that VHS boom, parents didn't know what their kids were watching, and censors didn't know what was being rented out of the dingy corner shops at all hours of the night. The new wave of unregulated horror was the perfect scapegoat. It wasn't the economy, it wasn't the schools, it was the movies. And horror has always been the punching bag for panicked adults who don't want to talk to their kids about reality. The tabloids went berserk. Headlines screamed about sick tapes warping young minds. The Daily Mail led the charge, warning that Cannibal Ferox was corrupting the nation's youth. Images of grotesque cover art were plastered across the evening news. Shock jocks and morning talk shows interviewed outraged parents who claimed their toddlers were now budding serial killers, thanks to films like Frozen Scream. Enter Mary Whitehouse, the self-appointed guardian of British morality. She spearheaded the National Viewers and Listeners Association. If you've never heard of her, think Dolores Umbridge with a Bible and a hotline to Parliament. She believed the devil was quite literally inside these tapes, and she lobbied like hell to ban them. And this all culminated in a wave of arrests, not of the filmmakers, but of video store owners. Imagine owning a corner rental shop and getting slapped with obscenity charges for renting out the beyond. That's what was happening. Tapes were confiscated, people were fined, stores were raided like they were drug dens. And then there were the public burnings. Yes, actual VHS bonfires. Britain went full Fahrenheit 451 for a minute there. It was like the Crucible, but with clamshells. So how did the DPP decide what was obscene? Well, that's kind of the problem. There was no standardized review process, no real rubric. If someone complained about a movie, the police might seize a copy. If it had enough blood, nudity, or general nastiness, the DPP could add it to the list. Sometimes the decision hinged on a single scene, an impalement, a sexual assault, a moment of cannibalism. But context, nuance were never really part of the evaluation. And that's why you get a list where The Evil Dead, a kinetic, over-the-top horror cartoon, sat side by side with films like SS Experiment Camp, which really had no business being watched by anyone, ever. Some of these films were later prosecuted in court and found obscene. Others were simply pulled from shelves in a preemptive effort to avoid trouble. In the eyes of the law, even owning these movies could land you in hot water. And yet, ironically, the list boosted interest in these titles. The blacklisting turned them into hot commodities. Collectors sought them out. Horror fans whispered about them like secret knowledge. Bootlegs flourished. Some of these films even gained cult status specifically because they were banned. And over the years, many of the once damned films have been re examined, re released, and even celebrated. The BBFC eventually relaxed their standards, and a number of the video nasties were passed uncut or with minor edits. The Evil Dead, now a classic, franchise gold. Tenebrae, now regarded as one of Argento's best, visually stunning and surprisingly clever. Cannibal Holocaust, still controversial, but seen by many as a critique of media sensationalism, not just exploitation. Movies that, not necessarily on the list, some were just added later: Dead and Buried, The Beyond, Possession, Inferno, all now sold on Blu-ray, some even getting fantastic 4K restorations. Of course, not all the films aged well. Some of the more offensive or poorly made entries, Frozen Scream, which I mentioned a moment ago, remain fascinating, if only as cultural relics, reminders of how censorship can sometimes inflate a film's legacy far beyond its actual merit. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? The video nasty panic wasn't about quality. It wasn't even truly about content. It was about control, about fear, and about who gets to decide what's art, what's dangerous, and what's worth protecting. The DPP's list of 72 titles might have started as a legal document, but it became something else entirely: a mythos for horror fans. It became a treasure map for moral crusaders. It was a hit list, and for video stores across the UK, it was a legal minefield. But more than that, it showed us how horror, more than almost any other genre, gets caught in the crosshairs of cultural conflict. It dares to offend, to provoke, and to disgust. And when the world feels chaotic, that makes it an easy target. The video nasties didn't kill horror, didn't even slow it down. If anything, they proved how powerful it could be, how much people fear the dark, and how much others crave it. So yeah, some of the movies are trash, but they're important trash. They sparked a conversation that's still happening today, a conversation about censorship, about media responsibility, and about that blurry, blood-soaked line between freedom and fear. And now the fallout? Well, it hit hard. In 1984, the UK Parliament passed the Video Recordings Act, effectively slamming the coffin lid shut on that wild anything-goes era of unregulated home video. The law made it mandatory for all video releases to be submitted to the British Board of Film Classification, that BBFC, for rating and review, and if they felt so inclined, slicing and dicing and editing. No more loopholes, no more rogue VHS distributors sneaking in Italian cannibal flicks into rental shops. No more horror nasties flying under the radar. Now, if you wanted to release a film in the UK, you had to play by the rules. And let me tell you, those rules were brutal. The BBFC became cinematic gatekeepers, and their scissors were anything but subtle. Films were cut to within an inch of their lives, sometimes losing entire scenes, sometimes whole reels, sometimes getting banned outright. For horror filmmakers, this wasn't just about losing shock. It meant losing narrative cohesion, thematic weight, and in many cases, their entire intended vision. Imagine trying to watch The Beyond with all the surreal gore stripped out, or Tenebrae without the stylized murders. You're not left with horror, you're left with confusion. And like I said, it's not just these obscure underground sleaze getting the axe. Evil Dead, that goes on to define DIY horror and spark a beloved franchise, was pulled from shelves. It wasn't even about cutting it, it was pulled completely. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre had already been banned for years, despite not showing a single drop of blood in its most iconic scenes. The censors, you see, they weren't just worried about violence. They were worried about tone, about implication, about anything that made the audiences squirm in ways they didn't approve of. But here's where things get interesting. Because horror fans, well, we don't back down from a fight, especially not when someone tells us we can't watch something. If anything, the ban made the video nasties that much more desirable. The films became forbidden fruit, cinematic contraband, whispered about in schoolyards and horror conventions, passed around in brown paper bags and unmarked clamshell cases. To own a copy of I Spit on Your Grave or Cannibal Holocaust was like having a piece of the Ark of the Covenant, if the Ark was full of dismemberment and sleaze. Fanzines began popping up across the UK and the US. Low-budget, Xeroxed passion projects written by horror nerds who treated these movies like sacred texts. They dissected each kill, debated the realism of gore effects, and reviewed fifth-generation bootlegs like they were fine wine. It was an era of underground film culture, and horror fans were the lifeblood of it. Collectors would spend small fortunes tracking down uncut versions, especially from mainland Europe or shady mail-order companies out of the US. And remember, this was pre-internet. You couldn't just stream Cannibal Holocaust with a VPN or a Shudder subscription. No, you were mailing cash in envelopes, praying the tape didn't break, and popping it into a wheezing VHS player with the lights off, volume low so your parents wouldn't know you were watching something banned by the government. This wasn't just movie watching, this was a ritual. For a whole generation of horror lovers, especially in the UK, the Nasties weren't just gory flicks with rubber limbs and screaming victims. They were a true rebellion. They stood for artistic freedom, personal curiosity, and a great big middle finger to the idea that adults couldn't decide what they wanted to watch in their own living rooms. And then the tides turned. Over time, the BBFC began to soften. Culture shifted. Audiences changed. And most importantly, the people in charge started to realize that horror fans weren't unhinged maniacs who needed protecting. We were cinephiles, nerds, passionate weirdos who loved the genre because what it says about us, not in spite of it. Many of those banned films reevaluated, some got resubmitted for classification, while a few still got slapped with edits. Others were finally released in their full uncut glory. Luckily, that's what happened with the once maligned Evil Dead. It got released completely uncut. And as we all know, it became a full-blown franchise, spawning sequels, TV shows, comic books, video games, and even a musical. So from video nasty to cultural institution. Tenebrae, once demonized for that stylish violence, began to be recognized for what it was, a masterwork of giallo cinema, a psychological slasher with high art ambitions. Critics who once dismissed it as exploitative revisited it with fresh eyes and saw the craft, the structure, and the deliberate beauty in Argento's mayhem. And as I mentioned, even the most controversial entries, films like Cannibal Holocaust, infamous for their blend of animal cruelty, real violence, and faux documentary style, got their moment of reconsideration. And I'm not saying it's an easy watch, but I want to be clear. The ethics of its production are still murky, if not outright damning. But in terms of influence, it paved the way for the found footage boom, from the Blair Witch Project to Paranormal Activity. Its DNA is baked into the horror genre now, whether you like it or not. By the early 2000s, most of the once banned nasties had been either released or reviewed. The Video Recording Act was still in place, but the BBFC was no longer wielding it like a bludgeon. Instead, they began working with filmmakers, discussing context, intent, and artistry. Horror had clawed its way out of the gutter and into the light, not sanitized, but respected. And here's the thing that gets me. This whole saga, from moral panic to critical reevaluation, just proves what horror fans have known all along. Horror matters because it challenges, it provokes, and it reflects the time we live in, whether that's Cold War paranoia, consumer anxiety, or just the fear of losing control over our bodies and minds. It doesn't just scare us, it speaks to us. And when society tries to bury it, burn it, or censor it, it just gets stronger. So let's be honest here. Not all the video nasties deserve the cult status they've been handed by time, trauma, and tape trading nostalgia. Some of them, straight up garbage. I'm talking poorly dubbed, plotless, shot in a garage with a camcorder trash. Films so incoherent or offensive they feel like a fever dream you're glad to wake up from. But buried among the moldy reels and moral panic are some true bangers. Films that still bite even decades later, whether it's through raw atmosphere, gonzo gore, or sheer audacity. These titles stand the test of time, or at least earn their place as milestones in the history of horror. So, I'm going to go over some more in depth than others, but my personal picks from the nasty list that I think still hit hard, still haunt, and still have something to say, even if what they're saying is, watch me gouge this eyeball out in glorious close-up. First and foremost, the movie I've mentioned more than any other in this episode is 1981's The Evil Dead. It's a no-brainer, and to me, it's the crown jewel of the nasties pile. Not because it is the goriest, but it is pretty damn gory, but because of what it represents, that pure, uncut indie horror energy. Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and a bunch of broke film nerds went into the woods with duct tape, corn syrup, and a dream. And they came out with this relentless roller coaster of demonic carnage that helped shape the genre. It's the definitive DIY masterpiece that bleeds creativity from every frame. The camera work alone, the frantic whooshing POV shots that basically invented the demon cam, well, they still hold up as some of the most dynamic horror cinematography of all time. And Bruce Campbell, he's a king. He starts out as a final guy with a floppy haircut and ends up as this blood-splattered icon wielding a chainsaw hand in future sequels. The fact that this movie got slapped on the nasties list is almost funny now. Yes, it's violent, but it's also clearly fantastical, over the top, and self-aware in ways most of the other entries weren't. It's not just a good video nasty. The Evil Dead is a great horror film, period. Number 2 for me is 1982's Tenebrae. Now, Dario Argento has always walked a razor-thin line between art and exploitation, and with Tenebrae, he struts it like a runway model in blood-soaked leather gloves. This is Argento at his sleazy, stylish best. It's part giallo murder mystery, part meta commentary on horror and censorship. Tenebrae features a razor-wielding killer, an unnerving soundtrack by Goblin, and that famous tracking shot over the roof line that still gets film nerds foaming at the mouth. It's glossy, it's gory, and it's absolutely drenched in paranoia and psychosexual tension. Argento gives us scenes that feel like nightmares. A woman trapped in a white hallway, blood painting the walls like abstract art, or just the sound of a straight razor as it slices through the air like a whisper from death itself. Sure, some of the acting is wooden, the plot twists are bonkers, but that's part of the charm. This isn't reality, it's Italian horror opera. And when it comes to the nasties, Tenebrae, is among the most beautiful and brutal of the bunch. Number 3 is 1981's The Beyond. Now, if The Evil Dead is manic and kinetic, and Tenebrae is calculated and cerebral, The Beyond is dreamlike, or more accurately, nightmarish. Lucio Fulci's masterpiece is less a movie and more a descent into hell's waiting room. Plot? Well, sorta. It's a woman inherits a hotel in Louisiana that sits atop one of the 7 gates of hell. Bad things happen. Eyes melt, spiders eat faces, logic takes a smoke break. Fulci's approach to horror is all mood and moments. He strings together images that don't always connect narratively, but they hit you on a gut level. Like the blind woman in white wandering through the mist, or the painterly framing of rotting corpses, or that bleak, unforgettable ending in the otherworldly void. The Beyond feels cursed in the best way possible. Like it shouldn't exist. Like watching it somehow violates a natural law. It's atmospheric, grotesque, and strangely poetic. One of the few nasties that might make you feel like you're actually being haunted. Now, I want to switch gears for this next one because it's not classy, it's not poetic. It's 1980's Night of the Demon, not to be confused with the 1957 Supernatural film. This is a Bigfoot revenge movie with an absurd body count and the most infamous crotch-ripping scene in horror history. Yes, you heard me. A biker takes a leak in the woods and pays the ultimate price. Bigfoot grabs his chunk and just tears it clean off. It's not subtle, it's not necessary, but you will never forget it. This film is pure grindhouse success. It feels like it was made by people who lost a bet and decided to just go for broke. Bigfoot attacks with a tent spike. A woman gets whipped with her own intestines. The creature costume looks like your cousin's Halloween outfit from Spirit Store clearance aisle. But that somehow adds to the charm. It's bad. Like really, really bad. But it's also the kind of bad that sort of loops around into greatness. So if you're a fan of gonzo horror and that what the hell am I watching cinema, Night of the Demons is a must-see curiosity. And then there's the lesser-known nasty that I think deserves more love. 1979's Don't Go in the House. It's often lumped in with the other don't horror craze of the late 70s and early 80s, but unlike Don't Go in the Woods or Don't Answer the Phone, this one actually tries to say something. The story centers on Donnie, this deeply disturbed man who lives in a decaying mansion and incinerates women in a fireproof steel room. Now, before you write it off as another misogynistic kill fest, it's worth noting that Don't Go in the House explores trauma, repression, and the cyclical nature of abuse in a way few nasties or few films do. Donnie was burned as a child by his overbearing, puritanical mother. Now, as an adult, his psychosis manifests through fire. The kills are brutal, but they're symbolic. The whole film feels heavy, suffocating, sad, and that makes the violence land differently. It's not fun, but it is effective. And it's no surprise this one got that nasty label. Incineration scenes in slow motion, well, that'll do it. But there's more going on here than just shock. It's an unsettling, psychological profile wrapped in grimy 16mm texture. And as a little bonus, I want to talk about Joe D'Amato. If you know, you know. If you don't, well, let's just say his films are not for polite company. Anthropophagus is infamous for one scene. A man eats a fetus. It's not subtle, it's not tasteful, but it sure got this one slapped on the banned list. And yet, beneath the shock factor, there is a legitimately creepy, slow burn island horror movie hiding in here. The gore is way over the top, and the atmosphere is grim and effective. Think the Hills Have Eyes, the original, by way of Italian exploitation. Its unofficial sequel, Absurd, is D'Amato's attempt at an Italian Halloween, a silent, unkillable killer stalking a suburban neighborhood. It's a bit more accessible, and by that I mean only moderately depraved, but still filled with nonsensical dialogue, absurd kills, and synth music that slaps harder than it has any right to. These are not good films in the traditional sense, but they are experience films. They test your limits. They ask, how far are you willing to go for gore? And sometimes, at least I found, the answer is further than I expected. Now, these films, not just about violence, they're about boundaries. What filmmakers could get away with, what society could tolerate, and what fans could handle. Now, while some of the nasties deserve to stay buried under video store rubble, others, like The Evil Dead or The Beyond, have carved out permanent homes in horror canon. Others, The Night of the Demons, sit proudly on our shelves labeled, "What the did I just watch?" But all of them, they share one thing. They remind us that horror has always lived on the edge. And sometimes the edge is exactly where the fun is. Now, before I wrap things up, I've got something truly twisted and deliciously depraved lined up for all of you horror hounds out there. In honor of the blood-soaked legacy and absolute lunacy of the video Nasties, I'm launching a brand new series here on Real Talk Horror Edition. Over the next several episodes, I'm going to be peeling back the flesh on 9 of the most notorious, baffling, brilliant, and outright bonkers films from the Nasties era. Some of these are certified cult classics, others are the cinematic equivalent of a rotting jack-o'-lantern in July. Bizarre, foul, and yet you just have to keep looking. So this isn't just a rewatch, this is an autopsy, a dissection of the myths, the controversy, the questionable editing choices, and the legacy each of these flicks carved out of the annals of horror history. I'll talk about how and why they ended up on the DPP's or other countries' dreaded lists, what makes them tick or sputter, and if they're still worth your precious midnight movie slot. So grab a flashlight, maybe a crucifix, and definitely don't invite your more respectable friends over for these viewings. Here's what I'll be throwing back into the VCR. I'm going to kick things off with a film that feels like someone filmed a fever dream on expired film stock. The Headless Eyes, directed by Kent Bateman, is sleaze with a capital S. It wastes no time throwing you into its filthy, blood-splattered world. It follows a struggling artist who, after losing an eye during a botched robbery, goes on a rampage, collecting eyes for his visionary pieces. This one, part grindhouse, part art school meltdown, and 100% grimy New York exploitation. There's something hypnotic about how weirdly poetic it tries to be while still drenching mannequins in blood. It's not good, but damn is it unforgettable. And then we're going to clean off some of the grime, sort of. Dead and Buried is one of the more polished films on the list, and if you haven't seen it, you're really in for a treat. This one is a slow burn mystery that leans into folk horror and small town paranoia. A sheriff investigates a series of brutal murders in a seemingly sleepy seaside town. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is what it seems. Little bonus trivia, the screenplay for this one was written by a young Dan O'Bannon, the same guy who started out with John Carpenter and Dark Star, and then went on to write Alien. And this film's effects, straight from the genius mind of Stan Winston. That pedigree alone should clue you in. This one has got more going on beneath the surface, and it's a nasty little gem with a twist ending that hits like a shovel to the skull. Then we'll take a detour into Egypt, where sand, sweat, and rotting flesh combine in a flick that's equal parts Indiana Jones and backyard splatterfest. Dawn of the Mummy from 1981 is another one that's not a good film, but it is an experience. Models and treasure hunters awaken a cursed tomb, unleashing undead that walk like zombies but wear ancient jewelry. It is goofy, it is tone deaf, and the gore goes from 0 to ridiculous in seconds. The third act is a full on zombie invasion with some impressively gross makeup work. It's a mess. But if you've got a soft spot for undead mayhem baked in the desert sun, this one is a trashy delight. And then Lucio Fulci's 1979 classic Zombie. It's probably the crown jewel of this series, that or Dead and Buried. This is the one that went toe to toe with Dawn of the Dead in Italy and won the war in sheer grotesquerie. Eye trauma? Check. Splinter to the eye? Check. Underwater zombie vs. shark? Check. Literal jaw-dropping gore? Absolutely check. This is a film where plot is secondary to set pieces, and every scene is built around giving your gag reflex a workout. It's sweaty, it's disgusting, and kind of beautiful in its own apocalyptic way. We'll talk Fulci's style, the film's infamous marketing campaign, and why Zombie is still one of the best gut munchers ever made. And then the next one is a bit of a trip. If you took a stack of half-finished screenplays, a vat of dry ice, and a church basement with poor lighting, you'd get 1975's Frozen Scream. This one's got everything: cults, immortality serum, zombie-like experiments, and voiceover narration that was clearly added when the producers realized none of it made any sense. This is one of the least coherent films ever to land on the Nasties list, and that's saying something. But for fans of oddball 70s horror, there's a strange charm to the way it fails. It's like watching a bad dream, and that makes it weirdly perfect for this series. Then we'll pivot into the nastier, grittier end of the spectrum. Mad Dog Killer from 1977 is less horror and more raw, mean-spirited Eurocrime with a psychotic edge. This one follows a sadistic criminal on a rampage after escaping prison, and let's just say he doesn't exactly rehabilitate. This film pushes the boundary between horror and exploitation thriller. It's violent, unrelenting, and loaded with that nihilistic 70s energy that leaves you feeling a little dirty afterward. It is not fun, but it is ferocious, and a good reminder that films like the Nasties weren't all slashers and zombies. And then one of the more controversial titles on the list, 1977's Fight for Your Life. This film is essentially Last House on the Left, but filtered through racial violence, totally offensive dialogue, and a constant sense of dread. A home invasion by escaped convicts turns into a battle of wills and survival between a black family and their tormentors. The film is brutal and unforgettable by design. Whether it's exploitation or commentary is something we'll wrestle with, but it's also a fascinating case study in why some films were targeted so aggressively. It pushed buttons then, and I think it still does now. Next up is Aliens, exploding torsos and synth music. Yes, please. 80s Contamination. It's Italy's shameless ripoff of Alien, but it brings enough weird energy to stand on its own. Instead of xenomorphs, we get pulsing green eggs that burst into acidic goo. It is all very gooey, very green, and very Euro horror. We'll talk about how Contamination sits somewhere between sci-fi thriller and gross out body horror, and why it still kind of rules if you just don't take it too seriously. And then we'll end the series on one of the more disturbing entries. 1975's Last Stop on the Night Train. It was also known as Night Train Murders. It's sort of an Italian riff on the Virgin Spring. And yeah, it gets grim. Two young women are traveling home for Christmas and wind up on a train with predators who turn their journey into a nightmare. This film, it's gorgeously shot, cold as hell, and unrelenting in its portrayal of violence. But it also has these moments of haunting beauty. It is a tough watch, but one of the most artistically crafted films to ever make any nasty list. So that's the roadmap. 9 films, 9 nasty little milestones in horror history. Over the next several episodes, we'll explore the controversy, the context, and the chaos surrounding each one. I'll let you know if I think it's a forgotten classic, a misunderstood masterpiece, or just a steaming pile of celluloid filth that belongs at the bottom of a discount bin. This series is more than just a watch list. It's a time capsule, a peek into an era when VHS felt dangerous, when horror was seen as a societal threat, and when films could be banned, prosecuted, and still passed around in secret by fans who just wanted to see what the fuss was all about. So if you've ever been curious about the nastiest horror had to offer, well, consider this your guided tour. Bring snacks, bring a barf bag, and bring your most open, maybe warped mind. Because when we begin, we're pressing play on the kind of films they didn't want you to see. We're going to do it with style. So, my final thoughts. Why does this bizarre, blood soaked footnote in UK censorship history still matter? Why do we still talk about these cheaply made, poorly dubbed, often wildly offensive horror flicks from 40 plus years ago? Why does the term video nasty still have power, still carry a sort of whispered weight among horror fans, like it's some forbidden incantation? Well, because the story of the video nasties isn't just about gore. It's not just about low budget carnage or eye gouging zombies or whatever sleazy tape was getting passed around in brown paper bags. It's a story about fear, and not the kind we see on screen, but the kind that lives in society itself. The fear of change, the fear of youth, the fear of freedom, the fear that something just might slip past the gatekeepers and corrupt the innocent. And at the center of all of it, right in that messy, pulpy heart, is horror. So, my quick breakdown: the video nasties came out of a very specific moment in the early 80s, in a world that was shifting fast, technology moving quicker than people in charge knew how to handle. Suddenly, your average working class family could rent or buy movies, including stuff that would never play in a British cinema. Stuff that was full of violence, nudity, depravity, and themes that made the censors sweat. And for the first time, control was leaving the hands of institutions and entering our own living rooms. No ticket booth, no film board, no polite usher giving you side eye as you tried to sneak into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Just you, a VCR, and whatever gnarly tape the local corner shop was bold or clueless enough to carry. This scared the hell out of authorities. Censorship always shows up in a nice tidy suit, says it wants to protect the children, shield the public, preserve the decency. But it rarely stops there. The real goal is never just to suppress content. It's to control the narrative of what's acceptable, what's art, what's valuable. And horror has always lived outside that circle. It's messy and emotional. It pushes boundaries because that's the point. The video nasties became a battleground for those boundaries. Suddenly, low budget horror was treated like contraband. Movie store owners were arrested, tapes were seized. People like Mary Whitehouse, who probably thought Hammer films were already too risque, were out here acting like Anthropophagus was going to single handedly collapse Western civilization. And here's the kicker: most of the politicians and activists who were leading the charge never even watched the films. They were just judging the movies by their titles, their posters, and their reputations. It was the horror vibe that offended them. The mere idea of letting the general public access something unfiltered, unsanctioned, and unapologetically gruesome. So while the censors were flipping out about driller killer corrupting minds, horror fans were discovering something deeper. Our genre was dangerous again. And in a world stuffed with polite, formulaic cinema, that danger was intoxicating. And let's be real, the part of what made the Nasties so appealing was that we weren't supposed to watch them. That blacklisted mystique gave them a kind of power they often didn't earn on cinematic merit alone. Some of these films are frankly trash, cheaply made and misogynistic, riddled with bad acting and even worse editing. But when you're 15 years old and you're huddled in your friend's basement with the lights off, a second generation copy of Tenebrae on a fuzzy CRT screen, none of that matters. It's not about quality, it's about transgression. Watching a video nasty felt like sticking your hand through the veil, like reaching into a hidden part of the world you weren't supposed to touch. It wasn't just fun, it felt dangerous. And that, to me, is the real legacy of the Nasties. They created a generation of horror fans who understood that art isn't supposed to be safe, that some stories are meant to disturb, that horror is more than jump scares. It's a reflection of our culture, our politics, our fears. And when the authorities said this film is too graphic, too brutal, and too offensive for the public, us horror fans, we heard something else. There might be something in here worth seeing. Not every nasty is high art, but some of them are closer than we ever gave them credit for. The Evil Dead, Banned and Butchered, spawned a beloved franchise. Tenebrae and the Beyond have since been studied for their cinematography, their surrealism, their uniquely European flavor of terror. Even Cannibal Holocaust, for all its controversy, is often discussed and debated in academic circles for its commentary on media exploitation and colonialism. So what changed? Time, perspective, maybe a little growing up. As horror matured and as horror audiences matured, we began to see what lay underneath the gore. We started to recognize that shock isn't the opposite of meaning. Sometimes shock is the meaning. A good horror film doesn't just show you violence, it makes you question it. A great one makes you feel complicit in it. The Nasties, for all their uneven quality, opened the door for a lot of us. They showed that horror didn't have to be safe or sanitized. It could be raw, it could be ugly, and in that ugliness, we found something real. So, what do the video nasties represent now? Well, they're a rite of passage. They're like the punk zines of the horror world. Scrappy, offensive, low-budget labors of love, or labors of obsession. They're not just about what's on screen. They're about how we found them. They remind us of the thrill of discovery, of stumbling across a tape you weren't supposed to find, of watching something too young, too late at night, and feeling it etch itself into your brain. They remind us that horror fans are a little different. We seek out the dark corners. We want to be challenged, disturbed, maybe sometimes even traumatized, because deep down, we understand something most genres don't touch. Fear is part of being alive, and learning how to confront that fear through story, through imagery, through blood-soaked VHS tapes is something that is weirdly beautiful. Look around today. The idea of a nasty hasn't gone away. It's just evolved. Now it's streaming bans, algorithmic suppression, online outrage mobs. The battleground has shifted, but the fight is the same. Horror still gets the short end of the stick, still gets overlooked by awards, still gets labeled as trash before it's even seen. But horror fans, we're used to that. We were raised on nasties, and that's why they still matter, because they're a mirror, not just of the blood and brutality we fear on screen, but of the moral panics, societal controls, and generational divides that simmer off screen. To understand the video nasties is to understand how culture reacts to horror when horror holds up a mirror it doesn't like. When the blood looks a little too real. When the monster starts to resemble something outside the TV screen. So yes, the Nasties still matter. Not because they're all great films, because they're not, but because they stood at a crossroads between art and obscurity and obscenity and misogyny and fear and control, between what we were told to watch and what we choose to see. I mentioned at the top, I will put the list or a link to the list of the original 72 video Nasties in the show notes if you want to check out those films. But that's going to be it for this episode of Real Real Talk Horror Edition. If you have a favorite Nasty or just a tape you watched way too young and probably still think about, hit me up on Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky, TikTok, YouTube, all at The Real Real Talk, or over on X at Real Real Talk Pod, wherever you get your weird film takes. And don't forget, whether it's banned, buried, or bootlegged, horror always finds a way to crawl back. Until next time, keep it bloody, keep it weird, and for the love of VHS, don't forget to rewind the tape.